So welcome. Greetings, all of you. We're so glad that you are joining us here at this summer special edition of Trainer Talk. And today I have with me Dr. Lisa Palmer Olson and Marlene Best. And we were going to have George here, and some of you signed on a little bit early could hear that George wasn't able to make us at the last minute. He's at a Boy Scout camp with his kids and troop, and thought he would be able to get internet connection, was planning on that, and we had the schedule before that scout retreat came up, I believe, and so he's not with us, but we have with us Marlene Best, who has done a lot of work with Lisa and of course with George, and does a lot of supervision in using the EFT model of supervision. So we're really glad to have you stepping in here with us, Marlene. So welcome.
So Lisa, hi everybody.
Yeah, let's say hi to everybody. Glad to see people still signing on, and glad to have you all here. And that you're signing in and saying.
Can I ask you a quick question?
Yeah.
Can I just ask you a quick question? I'm not to be monitoring the chat box, right? That's something you're going to do for us?
Yep.
I just want to make sure. I'm used to having to do both, so I just want to.
You're more than willing to, but I will.
Oh, okay. Okay, so I'll try to do both. I think is what that means.
No, you don't feel like you have to, but I don't want to restrict you either if you're used to it.
So I guess first I want to start with just saying thank you, Marlene, for stepping in. I didn't even know that you were coming today for this hour. Oh, you did?
I didn't either.
Cool.
I just found out about this morning.
As you know, most of you know that Marlene and George and I work very closely in terms of how we work in the EFT training and supervision piece. And I think Marlene and George have probably at this point, alongside of Jim Furrow, done the most dig-ins with me, which has really helped kind of develop the way that we are teaching and supervising in the model. So having her or George here to me are kind of equally the same. She has presented with me as well in Ottawa this particular model, and also, like I said, been a part of the experiential process. So she's stepping in for us last minute.
But I don't have the right accent.
Which is awesome, so I appreciate
the
right accent. The New York one, you mean? The New York, that's funny. So maybe we can just start with, I think it'd be helpful, Marlene, I can also kind of walk you through what we were planning on talking about, but what I'm reviewing here when I've looked at some of the questions that people have brought in or sent in for this training was around mostly like the how-tos of supervision, but also just a general structure of the model. Have most of, I guess I can't ask that question because not everybody has audio. Is that how this works? They can't really talk back, right? Or I guess they can in the chat box.
You know, Lisa, if people have a headset on, any of you, if you do have a headset on, and if you've attended any online kinds of things with me before, you have a headset on.
Oh, cool. Okay. Okay, great. So we were planning on, George and I were planning on just talking about how we ended up moving into a more experiential, structured way of teaching the model. And part of that actually stemmed from just my own learning and training in EFT, and also was really anchored in my work in my doctoral program and the dissertation. So I guess the part I want to be transparent about is I had a hard time learning the model through the doctoral program to a point where I really felt like I knew it at such a rich and a real level of depth. I just kept having these experiences where I felt like I was just over the top of what I really needed to know. So I started looking at the people who were trainers and supervisors at the time. I was a supervisor, but wanted to be kind of at the Sue Johnson level. And I started looking at what actually they felt were the most meaningful moments in their learning. And 100% of them talked about, in the interview process, talked about the experiential moments that applied both to their own life but also to their couples. So a lot of those learning moments, or those gems, kind of as Fasha would say, had to do with something personal that was happening for them that was either blocking them during their process of learning EFT, or something they were experiencing in their own relationship, and kind of tying those two together, and then really taking a piece of that kind of that information and applying it within their couples work. So, and that particular experience had happened to me as well over time. And when I started looking at kind of where my own blocks were, I noticed that that had been something that no one had ever asked me about throughout my time in my doctoral program. So that was kind of the next step. I went and interviewed, actually met Marlene for the first time back then in 2000, and started talking to other people that had been trained in the model for, over 10 years. And part of the research was looking at, during your time of learning the EFT model, had anybody talked to you about how you felt as a person, your view of self, your view of what was getting in the way of you being able to kind of apply this model at a level that felt like it was certifiable. And 100% of the registrants, or not registrants, of people who responded to that survey said that no one had ever talked to them during their training about their own experience of what was happening either in their own relationship, their own family of origin, or what their personal blocks were to really access and deepening affect, which we know is one of the hardest things to do in EFT. So that's really where a lot of this model has come from, that research, and then also the dissertation, and then now the model that was presented in the JMFT paper, which I'm happy to forward along to everybody if you haven't had a chance to read it. Although by the time it was published, I'd already updated that model. So we submitted it, and it was approved and not actually published for a couple of years. And that, during that process, the whole dig-in started. So I actually wrote to JMFT and asked them if I could send in some edits, and they said absolutely not. So whatever came out in that paper, I felt like needed to be updated as well. So I'm happy to send you what I would have sent in if they let me update as well. So maybe we can start with a couple of questions just before we get to the actual participant questions, if you haven't, or maybe Marlene, you could talk. Actually, I'd love if you could talk a little bit about your development of kind of how you do supervision as well, and training.
Well, my process was very much parallel in the sense that in my training, nobody ever asked me about my own personal experience either. Well, that's not quite true, actually. There were times in supervision with Sue, I had the good fortune of being one of her doctoral students at the University of Ottawa, and there were times when, because she did role plays right from the beginning, there were times when she got me to role play my client, and then asked me about my experience in the client's shoes. So not so much as the therapist, but in the client's shoes, what was I experiencing, to help me get a better experiential sense of my clients. So in that sense, I think Sue did spend some time sometimes asking me about my personal experience. But that was my only experience in grad school of any supervisor asking me about myself and my own experience. So
right. So if you look at that, because I had that experience as well, and I think Becca probably did as well, but I don't want to speak for her. But certainly sitting with our clients, reactivity and kind of sitting and being them was helpful. What I was looking at in the dig-in process, which you know about, Marlene, and I think it's helpful to look at, is it goes beyond kind of what we experienced, which is not only what's happening for you in the moment, but actually taking that a step further into, something like, for example, if you're in a distressed relationship, and how what you notice in your therapy is that you kind of lean away from moments of escalation, or you try to kind of pat it down, right? Being able to identify that in the moment and find a way to anchor yourself and still be able to kind of be fluid with the model and not lose your way, there's some things that need to happen, right, in that process, and helping people to get anchored and centered in that space and then still be able to use the model as their guide, I think is really important, right? And I never had that full progression all the way through.
Neither did I. And what I found as I did begin to look at that stuff was where I was getting stuck was couples that looked like my parents and how I responded as a child in those situations.
Yeah.
Right. So that was the beginning of me of exploring how my couple work was impacting me as a therapist, and how my own personal reactions were affecting what I did or didn't do in therapy.
That's really interesting because we've never shared that piece before, but I think that's the exact kind of doorway that I initially looked at as well, because having grown up in I guess a parental subsystem or a family system where we talked about everything and we had to kind of come to resolution. When I couldn't get resolution or couldn't fix the problem with the couple, I would find myself over functioning, which is exactly what I did with my own family, right? And so it would get in the way of me being able to really go into the darkness or the depth of which somebody was feeling because I wanted to fix it, right? And so that was a big block for me in terms of applying the model. But again, how did I learn that? And I think that was about really having somebody stay with me in that space, right? And make sense of what was happening for me, help me to kind of anchor in and apply what I knew, because I knew the model like inside and out. But the actual thing that I needed in that moment was an ability to kind of anchor in, to stay down regulated, resource what I knew how to do, and then also still continue to do the therapy versus pat it down. So that's interesting. I never knew you had that same first experience.
In fact, I needed somebody to sit with me. For me, it was the opposite to you. In my family of origin, they didn't talk about anything. So when things got hot, I just wanted to exit. It's like, I don't want to talk about this either. Right? Too dangerous. So I needed somebody to sit with me and say, okay, so where did you go, Marlene?
Yeah.
Where are you right now? This couple needs you to talk to them about what their experience is. And I didn't want to have anything to do with it. So that was my, I needed somebody to sit with me and ask and feel safe enough that I could enter these worlds and be safe enough. I didn't have to be a kid anymore.
Right. And a lot of those conversations, what I learned early on in EFT, were happening as side conversations between people that were bonded and close in things like advanced supervision or in your peer supervision group or in your, possible class kind of discussing EFT. It was like, oh my gosh, what happened to me right there? And then just the ability to kind of say it out loud and to be able to put it together and process together, co-burden where your struggle was. As a team was really helpful. And so that really anchored in for me what every other model in supervision, in MFT supervision, knows, which is having a real secure and safe alliance with your supervisee being a step one. And a lot of what Marlene and I have looked at, especially when we presented in Ottawa, was how the model, the 9 steps in the EFT model often mirror what we would do in supervision, and how alliance and just kind of assessing the development and where the person is in step 1 is really important. And how do you maintain that alliance with your supervisee? I think that's another thing. How do you discuss conflicts? How do you provide a platform for them to talk with you if there's been a miss, right? So we need to be modeling rupture and repair, because there will be some in supervision. Even if you work your very hardest to try to help somebody kind of walk into their best work, there will be moments where we miss something. But it's not about missing, it's about, can you get back in sync with each other? And you have to be able to have that conversation. So I think the initial kind of starting up with an alliance is very important. A lot of these questions that people have sent in, and I'm wondering, Becca, are you able to put these somewhere so Marlene could see them, or can we email them to her?
And George is here now. Did you see that George is here?
No, where is
he wants to say hello.
Well, too late.
So George, if you'll start your webcam if you can.
George, we already traded you out. Just kidding. Great. So come on, George, and then Marlene. All of us can stay on. Marlene, I want you to stay on
Sure,
if that's
happy to.
okay. Okay, cool. So are we going to be able to see him, or is he just going to be in the chat box?
Well, we'll just see what he
Okay.
can hook
Well,
up.
I'll continue on.
So,
But I would like Marlene.
yeah.
Can I just say
What?
something and just to tag on to what you said about rupture and repair? Dan Hughes said something very interesting to my ears at the summit last year when he talked about any form of assessment, whether it's good assessment or bad assessment, leaves people vulnerable and leaves people vulnerable to hurt. All criticism, all negative assessment, even all positive assessment, there's an implication that even when you assess positively, that on the other side of that, a negative assessment may be coming. And it leaves people open to hurt, that all assessment hurts. And I think we can't avoid that. That's not something that any kind of supervisory relationship can avoid. It's a given. So I think if we present that with to our supervisee, that this is going to happen, and how are we going to take care of you and our relationship in an environment where it's going to hurt sometimes. I think that's a very important starting place. Normalizes it.
Yeah, and I loved that comment, and I think, George has just presented with him too. He may have more to say on that, but I remember thinking at the summit, like, wow, that's a very true and profound statement, because we often underestimate what can happen for our supervisees, even when we're giving positive feedback, like their ability to take that in, and whether or not they can trust us and trust what we're saying has a lot to do with how they're impacted by the feedback, whether it be positive or negative. So it's a very important thing to remember, especially when you're discussing rupture and repair, because like Marlene is saying, to even add in that there may be times when I say something positive that might feel uncomfortable. I'd like to make sure that we're able to talk about that as well.
And if somebody's hurting, it doesn't mean that you've done something wrong or they've done something wrong. It's part of how we are as human beings, and we can try to just take care of that process together.
Yep, absolutely. So I guess looking at just the model of EFT supervision in terms of what's been presented, George and I talked about there's a structure of the model that can help you. Oh, there George is camping. So we talked about just presenting kind of the fundamentals, like a structure for how to do supervision and training in EFT. But we felt like the heaviest or most important piece for your learning, the thing we want you to walk away with the most in this hour, is understanding how to bring the experiential learning moments into the supervisory process, which I think is something we're just starting to do as a trainer team, more so in the last 5 years, but because we taught it from such a didactic level before, but how to bring those actually into the moment of your supervision hours with groups and also with individuals. We wanted to talk about that because oftentimes just thinking about bringing in experiential learning moments, it's good to kind of broaden how you teach EFT, but actually how you do that can be really challenging. Right. So George, I did talk a little bit about the progression of the EFT supervision model. Marlene shared her experience. Do you want me to keep going, or do you want to share kind of how you have come to organize your vision of EFT supervision and training? I don't want to move on without you if you want to add that in before we go forward.
Well,
you need to be louder.
Doing the best I can, but if this isn't loud, maybe I'll just I'll hang. Right? Can you hear me? This isn't loud, maybe yeah, I did. I adjusted it.
George?
I adjusted it. Yeah, I'll do the best I can, and if I'm
so it might be hard for him.
I can hear everything fine. I'm just not sure.
Okay, so it might be hard for him to hear.
Then I'll just sit back and listen to what everyone else is saying. Anything I would just add. bathroom, then all right. Can you hear me, Lisa, or not really?
I can hear you if my volume's up high.
Oops.
Whoops, we lost him.
So okay, so I'm just going to keep moving forward. I'll just keep moving forward with the model as we've laid it out, and then I just want to make sure that Marlene's able to see the questions, Becca, if that's at all possible, so she can see them up front. I know that George has them, but I just want to make sure that Marlene is able to have them if possible. So as we look at the model, I guess I'm echoing too now. If we look at the model of EFT supervision in terms of how it's been presented in the last couple of years, what we're looking at is the step one being a secure supervisory alliance, and part of that has to do with what we've just been talking about, which is being able to start with kind of assessment of where your supervisee is and be able to look at becoming a secure base for that supervisee. Being able to look at their levels of competence and confidence is very, very important. Their level of competency and confidence is directly related to whether or not they're able to apply what you teach them. So that's an interesting concept too that I'd like for you all to think about, is how confident they feel is directly related to how well they're able to translate and apply the feedback the following session. So that again speaks to how secure they feel with you. So if they have been kind of thrown off base, or they feel hurt or harmed, injured, or like they've had an unsatisfactory supervision, that may throw off their confidence level a bit. And if they can't have a conversation with you about that, or what's been kind of activated for them, then you're going to have more trouble with them being able to apply what it is that you've been trying to teach or train them on. So we very much pay attention to that, and we want you to notice and respond if you see those things happening. So you're really tracking and attuning with your supervisee just as you are with a client in those spaces, but providing more modeling and kind of a platform for that discussion. And you're always looking for strengths in their work alongside of knowing that sometimes even providing strengths can be difficult for people to hear. So we just want to keep an eye on all of those things. Obviously, the steps of supervision, we want to, across all models, one of the things that Dr. Mead found is that across all MFT models, the ones that had the most successful treatment outcomes included a manual, okay, a manual or some sort of manuscript that they can read, a workbook, something that they can read where they actually have to apply intellectual information. So they have to apply what it is that you've been teaching with them. So we know that EFT has a workbook, so we're already ahead of the game with that. So that's a good thing. So in your supervision and training of this model, you do want to be implementing some sort of workbook, some sort of direct practice in the moment. So the workbook, we think that research across all MFT models, we think is related to taking information, looking at the in-moment feedback from a session, for example, taking that information and having them kind of process with you what they just heard, look at possible self-therapist issues if that's coming up, but then taking that and applying it to a piece of clinical work. So that can happen actually within the session live with you as well. So you can have somebody show you where they're getting blocked, or you could have just watched it on the video, but then have them kind of replicate that, duplicate that in the session with you, and take that experience for them, move them to that place where they are blocked, and then spend some time, make some space to expand that and make sense of what's happening for them. So I'm so used to talking to the groups, I'm not used to I'm not used to not being able to interact with everybody. So I'm hoping that people can hear me okay. I'm assuming Becca would let me know. Let's see what.
Yeah, no, that's great, Lisa. I think, one of the things that's so important that you're talking about is these little nodes of experience and information and linking them together. So it's really similar to how we kind of zoom in and zoom out with the couple and the cycle to,
Mhm,
you know,
mhm. And I see, hi Sylvina, I also see here that you're saying, do we select specific workbook exercises that directly apply? Absolutely. But it also depends on, before I do something like that, which would be an intervention, to use the workbook, I would want to look at how does this person learn, right? So really taking into account, a workbook may not be the best format for some of your supervisees. Or although it also could be the best format for some of them. Some people would like to do something of that nature. I think that a combination of both is really helpful. I find that this is just based on my experience, and hopefully George and Marlene can speak to this as well, but my experience has been teaching this model across the years is that when I watch, and this is one thing I do, and I tell most of the people in our group to try this out because it's very helpful in terms of us learning about what's working for our supervisees. When we're working on something specific in a supervision session, I have them the very next session bring in that a specific period of time in their clip with that same couple where they were working on the thing that we had just talked about and worked on, or maybe provided an experiential moment the previous session. So that requires two things. That requires them to spend some time watching their own tape and looking for a moment where they were applying something that we had worked on. And then I'm able to see how did that translate, and what was it that contributed to that growth. So, and then really take the time to drill down on that and make sense, both from their perspective and mine. So if they were able to do something completely different than what we had seen them do in the previous week, and they were able to go in and do that exact thing that we talked about the next week, then I want to make sense of how come that worked, right? And that's important. We do that with our couples, and I do that with the supervisees as well. So what was it that shifted your framework, or kind of what you did in that moment with this couple? And I would say 100% of the time I hear, well, when we did that role play and I got right to that point where normally I kind of exit with her and take off and don't go down into the depths of her despair, I really got that when I do that, I was leaving her in the session each time, and then she would escalate. So that's an experiential moment that became something they could learn intellectually and integrate and then apply, right? So 100% of the time I end up hearing that people take those experiential moments and are able to apply them. So workbooks can work in terms of just furthering and deepening the knowledge of what they picked up on from the previous session, but I'd be interested to hear from you guys, from Marlene and George, about that too.
Can you hear me now, or
Are you able
not really?
to speak, George? Go ahead.
Oh, wow. We got lucky.
Yes.
Yeah, real quickly,
Oh
just
yeah,
what
that's
I'm
much
following. I
better.
mean, I look at
Much
it,
better.
and Lisa and I have talked about the three different degrees that I see supervision, where really the first degree, people are looking for a top-down understanding of the model, looking for steps and stages, organization. People attracted to the model are looking for that systemic focus. So that would be the first degree of what they're looking for. The second degree would really be seeing how themselves gets triggered and impacts the process. So, when you get anxious, you feel stuck and you start talking more. When you start talking more, what happens to your clients? You get further away from them. How does it impact the process? But it's still focusing on a therapeutic process. The third degree would be more of noticing when a therapist gets triggered and putting aside the therapeutic process and open up some space for the therapist, right? Which would be the most classic self of the therapist work that I think we would all do. But I'd like to even expand how we see self of the therapist. For me, so much of the focus where people get stuck
Mhm.
is the bottom up work, right? Dropping into emotion. So even when we try to introduce opening up space for the self of the therapist, it's when it's kind of getting blocked or when it's not going wrong. But for me, the self of the therapist, it's actually the greatest tool that we have in the process. So it's even shifting our own frame of how we see ourselves and how it impacts the process. Alan Shore, Dan Hughes all talk so much
Mhm.
about intersubjectivity. And it's actually the exchange of the therapist entering that space to co-regulate, co-create meeting. That's how we're creating new experiences. So looking at those isomorphic levels, that's exactly what's going to happen with our supervisees. So, this is a long-winded
Right.
question because I was left hanging out. But, as far as the workbook, it's the timing. Absolutely, we're
Right.
trying to integrate both hemispheres. We're trying to, at times, when do you need the workbook and the skill set to really understand and to organize? That's really important. And when do we drop down and actually do the experiential? But the one point I wanted to get across just to the group as they're listening is that even as you think about the self of the
Right.
therapist, I want you to expand that to include that's the best thing we have in the whole process is using ourselves and our. I just wanted to add that and kind of feel what you guys think of that.
Yeah.
And I would say that,
The image that I like,
yeah, and
the image
go
I
ahead.
like to use to illustrate that, George, is the tuning fork. That when we respond to our supervisee, or supervisees respond to their therapists respond to their clients and they get dysregulated, then if we can help the therapist or help the supervisee regulate it by understanding what's going on, then the whole frequency of the dynamic of of the the interaction changes. So if people can own their frequency, their vibration, their effect, both within themselves and on their interactee, whatever level we're talking about, if they can own that process, I think that really helps people understand
Absolutely.
how important their
Supervisor.
role is.
Mhm. And one of the the Pasadena dig-in that we just did, the trauma dig-in, um, the thing that was really profound to me is the biggest theme of the 2 days was about helping the therapist not be driven by the model, but driven by themselves and use the model as a map versus be driven by the model. Trying to do EFT to people versus let EFT be a guide, but you be yourself, right? So it's really the same thing. And I think what we see when people get blocked, when they're not able to kind of use the model, it oftentimes has to do with a lack of attunement, right? An inability to kind of deepen access primary emotion. And when you start making space for them to explore that, you find that there's some, could be some family of origin stuff. It could be some present relationship. It could be feeling like they're isolated in those spaces. But as they have a moment to discuss that and kind of process that, have an experience of being maybe feeling isolated and lost in the model, being able to then pull the map in, right, versus lose themselves in the EFT model. So the tuning fork, kind of George's vision, my vision, they all merge very nicely and really come back to us being ourselves is the most important thing in this model. That you can have all the magic tricks of EFT in your back pocket, but if you're not being you, then it's not authentic and it's not something that's going to move people or shift their clinical work. So, and I would say that fits for us as human beings, as trainers, as supervisors as well.
Absolutely.
So,
Yeah. Why? Can you hear me? Or I lose you.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
we lost
There was,
Can you hear me? I'm
Go ahead,
turning off
Becca.
my
recently
webcam.
on the listserv, I think somebody posted a,
No, I just turned off.
Oh no.
No, can you hear me? I just
go
turned off
ahead,
the
George.
webcam. So what I wanted to add that I mean, just looking at the level of a supervisor, that's why I think it's so important as a supervisor to, as our supervisees get dysregulated with their own triggers, if we meet them in that place with advice instead of kind of just being open to kind of help calm them down, then it's so easy for them to go into their own shame. So I think the timing of how we're going to come alongside of our supervisors really is important, and that's why that we need to have this hands-on training to, because I know so often in the beginning when I was supervising, I didn't recognize why my supervisees weren't getting anything, and what they needed was me to come alongside them, and what I actually did is just kind of give them advice and made them feel worse about it. So that doesn't feel so good for anybody involved.
Right. So, Becca, do you want to ask us do you want to give us which specific questions to respond to? I'm aware of the time, and I know we have 9 to get to, so there's a couple we can merge together, but maybe you can direct me to which one to go to first would be helpful.
Right. Yeah. Okay, sure. Yeah, let's look at the one that talks specifically, I think it's number 3. You know what to do with a supervisee that comes in for a session, but is
Okay, so they're actually coming into the supervision session feeling embarrassed and ashamed. So I'm hoping that I would know that they're experiencing that if I'm their supervisee or their mentor, or supervisor and their mentor. Um, I would say that that's a very common line that we hear coming out of the live sessions or kind of coming into group. It's a lot of kind of, you won't believe what I did to this couple. Or like one that we say here at the clinic a lot is, I took them apart, but I couldn't put them back together. So I guess the first thing that strikes me when I see this question is, I would really want my supervisee to feel safe enough to say, I'm overwhelmed, I'm embarrassed, I'm embarrassed to show you this. I hope we can talk about what it feels like to have this have happened. And maybe this is a question around what do you do if you know they're embarrassed and overwhelmed, but they're not safe enough to say it out loud? Maybe is that the question? Okay. So I would want to model and bring up, I would want to model vulnerability and bring up, like, I'm noticing that you're feeling maybe a bit overwhelmed or stressed out about showing this clip. Can we talk about kind of what you're worried about or what's bothering you? I would want to have the conversation. Marlene, George, do you guys have something to add to that?
I would definitely want to have the conversation also. And I use myself a lot. I've made so many mistakes. I felt so embarrassed. I've wanted to crawl in holes so many times that I use myself and examples of when I felt similarly, or I imagine that perhaps, sorry about that, that sorry. I'm transparent
One
in
of the
terms of
best
my own
things
experience, and hopefully that helps me move safer.
One of the best things I've ever done is show a clip where a disaster session, just one that went straight downhill to a core skills group. And it really disarmed the embarrassment factor in our group for showing clips. But sorry, George, go ahead.
and George?
Yeah, I say I'm sorry a lot more now than I ever have before. If what we're trying to do is get into attunement with our supervisees, then we're obviously going to be off the mark a lot of the time. So it's really liberating for you to be off the mark to just say, hey, I kind of missed that, or I was a little out in front of you, or help me kind of get this and let me get back into that space with you. It's really, for me, so liberating if you could have that flexibility and not have to kind of try to force it down.
Well, and I want, and like
so
I said,
know when I first started doing supervision, because I wanted.
Go ahead.
No, if I looked at my early supervision tapes, I probably rarely said I was sorry. So again, I think that shows the evolution as we become more comfortable with the model and ourselves and the process. It's just easier to kind of have that flow that's moving quickly.
Mm-hmm. So when you say that you're saying I'm sorry more in supervision, you're saying about when you, sorry, the delay is killing us. Go ahead, Becca.
Yeah, I missed the question.
Not only saying I'm sorry, George. Go ahead. Okay, go ahead, Lisa. No, yeah, I think we were just going to the same place, right? About saying I'm sorry. I think you're catching what you're talking about when those places that we miss. And if we were going to tie that back to this question about somebody coming in embarrassed, about their work, that might be an opportunity for us that we missed where they were. Maybe we were ahead of them skill set wise, or what we were asking them to bring in. That might be an opportunity. The other thing that, just in relation to the same question, is that we wouldn't really slow that down at all. At least I wouldn't have. I wouldn't say, oh, you're embarrassed. Let's just stop
Right.
and talk about that for a minute.
And
And
also,
I'm sorry if
they're
did.
coming in and they're feeling, they're able to share that they're embarrassed or overwhelmed. And I am wanting to go back and kind of check on the alliance and talk about what happened in their process kind of as they were coming into supervision. One of the things Richard is asking about is, can you speak about specific ways to work more experientially when their sense of self is getting in the way of the process? And I would say one thing I'm always aware of working with people is kind of, and this comes, I think, from, I'm just talking out loud here, but I'm aware of the attunement between the resonance between myself and the supervisee. And sometimes it's important for us to notice when they are experiencing something that feels like it's a theme across some of their couples. And just being able to notice and get curious about that together is important. And it will also tell you where their level of comfortability is around talking about these types of blocks, potential blocks in their actual application of the model. But I will just note, my number one thing is being myself and just noticing when it feels like something is getting in the way of them being able to move their couple along, and really allowing some time for that to unpack and look at together and explore together. So it's just like, oh, I noticed that this was happening for you. Can we spend some time and just make sense of what was going on right there? Or what are you feeling now as you're watching your clip in this moment where you were stuck? Or can you help me understand what got in the way of you feeling safe enough to bring in one of your, sessions where you were really struggling? A marker for me in the Supervisory Alliance is if they're bringing me in their best work and they're presenting it as that, then that's always a marker for me, like, okay, something's off with the alliance. When they start bringing in where they're really going downhill and they're struggling and they're really almost feeling like, I don't have a clue what I'm doing right here, when they're bringing those in and they can't wait to have us resource each other or have the group resource each other in those moments when they're struggling, that's a marker for me when I know that the alliance is secure. So I often will resource just that piece of, do you feel safe enough to bring it in, and can we talk about that if you don't feel safe enough to do that? So I think the experiential piece has a lot to do with our relationship with that supervisee. When that's secure, you have a lot more opportunities and doorways to get curious about. That will if you have an insecure alliance with your supervisee, if you don't have a community of people around your supervisees that they feel safe to go to, it will hijack the process and your resources become limited for adding in experiential moments. How about you guys? Do you have any specific ways that you would that you could kind of give them to think about working with their supervisees that you may do that's different? Okay.
No, I think you've kind of covered it, Lisa.
Sure. Yeah.
Do you want to go ahead to some of the other questions?
So Lisa, let's move to this question because I think this is a pretty tough one about, how to handle it when they come in. Well, you just described it just a little bit.
Yeah. Well, that's always an interesting one. I think that all of us have probably, all four of us on this camera has experienced that. One thing I've learned very quickly was that people that I work with consistently, often I don't have this issue with. Because if we're assessing where they are in the model, then I know something's off with our relationship, and that typically doesn't happen as much when you're working closely with somebody. But this can happen when you're doing supervision and somebody says, can you review my clip for supervision? You don't know them, and then they say they want to submit this. Can you review it? And then you see like, okay, well, this isn't quite where we want it to be from a supervisory level. Then I talk about that. But here is where I have set myself up to have a successful conversation. Before I ever see somebody's clip, I talk with them about what happens if this exact situation comes up. So I will say, before I've ever seen their work, I will say, it's not uncommon for us to look at a clip and for you to review a clip, and maybe we're seeing things differently, and we have to be able to have that discussion. And you may have some different feedback from other supervisors, but I want you to know if that comes up, how can we handle that together as a team, right? So there may be that we have differing views on this particular work, and especially this happens a lot when you don't know somebody and they send you a clip they want you to approve or not approve to send in for certification. George and I have had this happen just recently with a supervisee we're both working with, and I know, because I know him well, just like I could say about Becca and Marlene in terms of their work, that all four of us could watch the same clip and say, oh yeah, this is good, this is great, or this one's not quite where it needs to be. But I know if any of the four of us looked at it, we would probably give a very similar thread of feedback. And so George and I told George, hey, this one was really good, and he said, great. So we know we can kind of collaborate on that. But what happens when it gets tricky is if someone's already been given some feedback about a clip and they want then you to review it to see if you think it's good enough in quotes, not using my language. So that's really tricky. So if that's happened, I'm asking those two questions to set myself up to not have a bad experience, which is one, has anybody else reviewed this clip to protect yourself? And if so, I want to talk with them. So that's about being as a team of supervisors, even if you don't know each other. Somebody's sending you a tape to look at. You say, has anybody else reviewed this clip, and is it okay if I talk with them about it? And then that's one. And then the second thing is, and if by chance we disagree, how might we handle this as a team? And we set very specific goals and very specific feedback around where this could be deepened or this could gone a little bit differently. And we're real clear about that. So you guys, do you have other feedback on that?
I think that talking to people ahead of time. I think laying out the land before you go ahead and watch the tape is really critical. I think what you're saying is really important. Once that's done, if somebody really believes that what they've done is what they should be doing and it's good enough for certification, then and I watch it and I don't have that same feeling. Mm-hmm. I want to find out from them what it is they feel that they've done that is certification worthy. Like, what have they done well, and what might they, what's the strength in it, and is there any area that they haven't done as well in? But I want to know what it is that they see the value in, because I want to be able to try to support what they've done. I want to support the strengths. So I'll try to give them some positive feedback about what is strong to validate that, but also introduce my feeling about where it could be improved and why that is. So I want
Right.
it to be a collaborative
And I think
process.
systemically we're trying
I
to
don't want
address
I don't want to just shut their
the
whole
fact
process
that
down.
there can be varying opinions on clips, and we're trying to get some more core kind of systemic target zones for people so that it won't be so ambiguous around this is, this isn't. I know that's one of the things Marlene and I are working on in our supervision of supervision group, is creating that proposal to the board, the education and training board, around kind of what a stage 1, stage 2 clip would look like. And we've been reviewing those online as a team of supervisors in training to kind of learn and teach people what ICEPT is looking for. And if somebody's specifically focused on certification, I think it's important for us to have that conversation as being part of their goals, or an agenda that we would have to collaborate, like Marlene is talking about, collaborate together on. Some people do want to get certified, and they will come specifically to you to get certified. And then you really need to establish a baseline with that supervisee. Take a look at where they are in the model, look at how they appraise their work and how you appraise their work, and then set some specific goals. And this is something I see is lacking a lot within the supervisor culture, is this kind of not being specific about goals. And I think it's important, especially if somebody is heading towards certification and that's their agenda, that you have some goals in place that are measurable, that they can go back and say, hey, I was able to do this better, and it looks like let's increase up the ante on this one. Right? So it may initially be just some basic fundamental intellectual grounding on the theory. Then another person who's more advanced may be actually how to work an enactment all the way through, and have the couple kind of even reach to a step 7. So I think it's really important to set goals. This protects your supervisory relationship as well, and it makes it something when somebody's wanting to get certified that they still feel like they can look back and say, hey, I've improved here, here, and here. If it's ambiguous, they have nothing really they can grasp onto if that is their agenda. Other people don't come in with just that agenda. So it just depends.
I'll just pause for a second, make sure I'm not running into traffic. You know.
Right, and all of these things are also, the specific skills. Where the self-of-therapist work and the experiential work plays in there depends on
to help them,
how you and the supervisee kind of shoulder to shoulder are looking at where they're getting blocked in the model. Being able to say like, hey, this is where I think this is showing up in your work. Did you notice that? Right? And I think that's important. You can take those and you can set a goal. My goal this next 6 weeks is to notice when I start to become dysregulated, or I start to see that little raw spot show up in my work and I start to move away from the intense emotion. My goal is to notice that comes up for me and when that comes up for me. And then the next goal may be to have 3 or 4 things, resources that I can do in that moment to keep me on track. Right? That may be the next goal.
One risk, I think, when somebody is specifically wanting to get just certified, is that they go into their session and their main goal is to produce an enactment, or to produce an EFT
Right.
tasks in some way, and they lose contact with their session, and they're not present with themselves, and they're not present with their couple. They're present with you in their head, trying to get
Right.
them to do something, or them in their own heads trying to get them to do something, as opposed to be in the room with their couple, trying to help them in their relationship. So that can come up in terms
And I think too,
a
if you
challenge
keep
when
this,
somebody is
what
very,
George was
very,
saying
very
initially,
task focused,
if you keep
and something that can be
this
discussed.
self of the therapist piece and being yourself as a primary goal in all of our supervision and training in EFT, then if you're seeing somebody just EFT robot, a certification clip, you're going to be noticing that, right? you're going to be noticing that, and you're going to be able to bring that up and say, I noticed, because I know you well, it feels like this is not you being present and attuned with your clients. You're doing all the EFT skill set really well, but I don't know how present you were. What did you think about that? Right? So I think those are important too. So similar. And I think this last, I think the question number 9 is really the same thing. You know, someone who has all the skills of an EFT therapist, but you don't see it in their tape set. I mean, I think you have to have that conversation, and it has to be safe enough to have that conversation.
Yeah. Go ahead.
Mm-hmm.
You're also really describing and answering along the way
and I think,
here the question about what characteristics
I think if you
make up a good EFT supervisor.
If we look at what we're
and
saying,
we're really, talking
for
about
supervising
presence and
we
creating
mirror
safety,
that for exactly what
we're
we
being able
want
to
to
kind
be
of
as supervisors and
discern
trainers.
where they are as far as the knowledge base, but also
the best
emotionally, what
you
those
can have
blocks are, and able
as a
to
mentor
explore
in this
that.
model is to be humble, to be transparent,
So that,
authentic,
that
and be willing to go to those vulnerable spots when it's necessary. It doesn't mean it has to be every session of supervision, but being able to go there and being comfortable with that and modeling that is really important for us, right? As
So and that brings up, I think, maybe the final question that we can answer, because we're getting really close to time, although we may just go over a minute, I'm not sure. But
that's you, George. Can we hear him? Can he hear us? It doesn't look like it.
Over and over on this
okay,
personal
so I don't
level.
think he can hear us.
Could be.
So how much do we process with that? So I think Marlene and I have chatted about this quite a bit in terms of the gray area between supervision and therapy. And I think the anchor that I always hold on to is I absolutely will continue to process and make sense of what's happening for a therapist if they're blocked or I think this one talks about if their personal stuff is coming up. Absolutely. I want them to be able to resource me in that moment. I want to understand what that is. I want to make sense of it. But the difference between supervision and therapy is that my next move is to tie it into how it's playing out in their work and be able to point out the raw spots together, really make sense of those, integrate them, honor those as a strength, honor those as something that they can learn how to make a strength if it's not a strength in the moment, and then look at what can we do to help you move that raw spot into something that can be helpful in your work versus get in the way of you kind of using this model. So I'm not going to spend a whole hour kind of bringing somebody down into the depths of their grief around losing their mother, for example, but I may walk in there with them and just notice it and help them to experience me with them in that, so it's not so isolating and they don't get so dysregulated, so that when I see it show up again in their work, I'm able to say, oh, this reminds me of when we had that one conversation about this, and how are you working on that, and helping them as a stepping stone to moving forward with that.
I'll walk in with people as well, but I'll check with them to make sure that this is okay to go this far, and are we okay to do this? If the theme keeps coming up, I'll have a conversation about what they're going to do with this and what do they think is the best way to handle this. Are they handling it on their own? Is this something they can explore on them with them by themselves? Is this something that felt okay to do today with me? And I would also say that, you know, if it becomes a larger issue, if the person isn't already in therapy, or I can find out if they are, is that something that you might want to do? Have you? It might be something that it could get in your way. This is another option. So I leave kind of the whole field as options. Um, and if it seems to just keep coming up, I'll reflect that back. This seems to keep coming up, and how if what we're doing together doesn't feel
Yeah.
like it's enough, then I'll encourage them to
Right.
get therapy. But again, it's done collaboratively through a discussion, so it's not me telling them to get therapy. It's them choosing
Yep.
to work on to get some more additional help to work through this. Because sometimes things come up that blindside people. They don't realize that it's an issue they've dealt with before or thought they'd done with,
And
and it comes up again
and just to
in a
add to
different
that,
way,
and I
or
know we're ending,
completely
but
blindsides
you
them
know,
and
this
it comes out
word
of left field.
emotional
So you
Tupperware
can do.
that I learned early on in my training. I see a lot of the things that people bring in that we kind of walk in with their permission and kind of explore as we want to put some emotional Tupperware on it. It doesn't mean that we're shutting it down. It doesn't mean that it's plastic so we can't see through it. We have to be able to see through the Tupperware. They have to have control of, feel like they have control to open it or not open it. And they can let us in or not let us in. And we can see how it's still there. It's still in the room. We're still looking at it. We don't, and there are people that have been through, for example, going through divorce, and they have 22 couples a week, and we set some structured, consistent, predictable time to talk about how that's playing out within their couples. But they and I defined kind of when the Tupperware is closed and when we just notice that it's there, and how deeply we go into that, and whether or not we need to move it to a therapy session with someone else, not me. So, okay. So the vision of the retreat really comes from just a place to get the supervisors in training and present supervisors together. Marlene and I just want to mention this as well. We are running a supervision of supervision group where we address a lot of these things in a more specific fashion, I would say. It's a 2-hour group. It's once a month. We have a wait list of people that still want to continue doing this type of support. So the supervisors retreat comes from just hearing year after year like we need more support. So the vision of the retreat is to come. We will be providing legal and ethical 3-hour training as well to meet some of those requirements through the San Diego Center. It's actually within the retreat, but we want you to come and learn didactically what the kind of foundation is of EFT supervision, the structure of the model, the actual steps and stages as George was kind of referencing, and also the steps as it is upgraded since the JMFT paper. And then we want to take your moments in supervision. You're going to be bringing in a clip of a supervision session that was particularly challenging for you, or a group that was very hard to manage. We're going to go through some of those clips and take them and look at them and make sense of what was happening for both the supervisor but also for the supervisee, and then kind of wrap it into and integrate into what you can actually do and apply the next time you move in with this particular supervisee or group, and look at where your own blocks are. You know, like if you tend to overfunction and teach and give people too much information, to really kind of drill down and make sense of what that's about versus just being with them as a resource. So, and that may bring up some self of supervisor issues as well. So really though, to go through the process as a team, provide some legal and ethical CEUs for you at the same time, the didactic foundation of the model, and then really experience some difficult kind of ethical supervisory situations and how we might handle those, and be able to leave feeling more confident as a supervisor. That's the hope for that. It's not a
Sounds great.
weekend. It's a Thursday, Friday at Alliance
That's a weekend? That's a
International
two-day
University.
session, Lisa?
And you can be a supervisor in training. You can be a supervisor already. It's a supervisor support type setting.
That's great. Great. October 17th. Okay, great. All right. Well, it's been wonderful being here discussing this, and I think it's such an important topic for us to continue exploring and continue to talk about. And we do have the supervisors list too that we aren't really utilizing, but that's a resource for us as well, where we can be in more contact
Thanks,
with
Marlene,
each
for
other.
stepping in.
Thank you, Marlene, Lisa, George, who already had to cut out. But so glad that you guys came on today to
Thanks
Bye,
for
everybody.
including me.
Thanks,
bring
This was
this
fun.
more and more into the forefront.
I'll see you
So
tomorrow.
that we can be more effective
Bye.
and